It begins with a number that should not feel dangerous, a threshold crossed not by force, not by spectacle, but by accumulation, a count that quietly exceeds what internal calendars were prepared to absorb. On paper, nothing fundamental changes, no rule breaks, no switch flips, and yet the moment the number settles, something subtle misaligns. The system notices it first, not the public. Schedules stiffen, language becomes narrower, statements shorten. A process that was designed to absorb pressure begins to behave as if pressure itself has become the variable it can no longer normalize. There is no announcement, there doesn't need to be. The discomfort appears in the pauses, in the refusal to clarify something that would normally be clarified immediately, in the way staff stops predicting timelines out loud, in the way the word routine quietly disappears from internal memos. This is not escalation, this is friction, the kind that forms when a mechanism is asked to repeat an action it was never optimized to perform more than once, let alone again. The fracture does not arrive with defiance, it arrives with dispersion. Lawmakers crossing lines not as an act of rebellion, but as a symptom of weakening cohesion. Not courage, not protest, drift. The kind that happens when internal discipline relies on shared assumptions, and those assumptions stop being shared at the same time. Votes still count, procedures still apply, but alignment degrades. The machine doesn't shatter, it loosens. Institutions rarely fail when challenged from the outside. They falter when internal synchronization breaks, when actors follow the same rules but no longer agree on what the rules are protecting, when silence replaces certainty not because of secrecy, but because speaking prematurely now carries risk. This is how systems begin to hesitate, not loudly, not visibly, through ambiguity, through delay, through an unspoken agreement to wait for something else to move first. Impeachment in this moment is no longer a judgment mechanism. It becomes a stress test, not of an individual, but of procedural endurance. The process was designed to be exceptional, not iterative, singular, not recursive. Each repetition compresses timelines, blurs thresholds, erodes the expectation that escalation naturally leads somewhere. Pressure accumulates not at the point of decision, but in the space between steps, where calendars overlap, where rules technically apply but practically collide. Inside Congress, the tension does not live in speeches or hearings. It lives in sequencing, in which action must precede another, in what cannot begin until something else formally ends, in the awareness that initiating a process does not obligate the system to complete it within a time frame that still matters. The mechanism continues to turn, but the sense of destination weakens. Nothing has broken yet. No authority has been challenged outright. No outcome has been forced, but something has been set in motion that the institution is no longer certain it knows how to contain. The process advances, but cautiously, as if the system itself is listening for a signal it no longer trusts. And then comes the pause. Not a stop, a procedural inhale, a moment where everything technically proceeds, but nothing resolves. The machinery remains engaged, but its rhythm changes. The air holds, the system waits. At a certain point, the conflict stops behaving like politics at all. The language thins, the audience fades from relevance. What remains are filings, internal clocks, jurisdictional boundaries, and an expanding awareness that timing itself has become the decisive terrain. This is where the process migrates, quietly, away from cameras, away from statements, into spaces designed to absorb uncertainty without resolving it. Legal language does not argue, it delays. It reframes urgency into relevance, converts momentum into sequencing, transforms confrontation into dependency. Every motion carries a clock inside it. Every response window creates another window. What looks like stalling from the outside is internally compliance. Perfectly valid, perfectly defensible, perfectly exhausting. This is not lawfare in the theatrical sense. It is procedural gravity. Once entered, everything slows. The impeachment process, still technically alive, begins to overlap with mechanisms that were never meant to run in parallel. Criminal procedure does not pause easily. Congressional inquiry does not terminate cleanly. Each assumes primacy within its own domain. When they intersect, neither yields, because neither was designed to. The result is not chaos, it is congestion. A legal traffic jam where every actor follows the rules and no one reaches the intersection. Inside the Department of Justice, the anxiety is not ideological, it is structural. Prosecutors are trained to act within hierarchies of precedence, to avoid contamination, to preserve future viability. A live impeachment process introduces variables that cannot be neutralized by caution alone. Evidence timelines risk becoming politicized by proximity, not intent. Decisions risk reinterpretation not by courts, but by history. The fear is not of action. It is of acting at the wrong moment, under the wrong procedural shadow. Federal courts sense it too, not as threat, but as imbalance. Courts are built to resolve disputes, not to referee institutional self-examination at scale. When executive accountability, legislative procedure, and criminal enforcement overlap, the judiciary becomes a surface onto which contradictions project themselves. Any ruling risks appearing premature or evasive. Any restraint risks appearing complicit. Neutrality, once the anchor, begins to feel like exposure. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the subject dissolves. This is no longer about Trump, not about impeachment, not even about accountability. The center shifts to something colder. Whether enforcement institutions can be examined repeatedly, internally, without destabilizing their own authority. Whether a system built on episodic self-correction can survive continuous self-interrogation. The Constitution anticipates abuse. It does not anticipate recursion. Silence becomes functional, not absence, but containment. Statements narrow, updates slow. Media cycles move on, not because the issue is resolved, but because it resists resolution. Attention drains, fatigue sets in. This is not failure of interest. It is design advantage. Delay does not defeat a process. It outlives it. When relevance expires, verdicts lose weight without ever being overturned. Time passes. Not dramatically, administratively. Calendars roll forward. Priorities reorder themselves. What remains is a process that still exists, still operates, still consumes resources, but no longer commands urgency. Impeachment without climax, accountability without endpoint, a constitutional mechanism running indefinitely, producing heat but no ignition. Systems do not always collapse under pressure. Sometimes they adapt by becoming inert. They continue to function but stop responding. Not broken, not corrupt, simply unresponsive. The procedure remains open. The machinery hums, and somewhere inside it, the answer waits for a moment that may never be procedurally reachable and the sentence never quite finishes. What follows is not escalation in the traditional sense. It is normalization. Procedures that once triggered alarms now trigger workflows. Extraordinary steps become routinized through repetition, not because they are accepted, but because institutions adapt to survive friction. The abnormal does not need to be justified anymore. It only needs to be processed. This is how weight disappears without being lifted. Internally, references change. What was once cited as precedent is now cited as context. Language subtly adjusts to accommodate endurance rather than resolution. Memos no longer ask whether a process should continue, only how it should be managed if it does. The question of legitimacy dissolves into the question of sustainability. Can the system carry this indefinitely without drawing attention to the fact that it no longer knows where it is going? Oversight mechanisms begin to resemble background radiation, always present, rarely decisive. Hearings occur, transcripts accumulate, statements are logged, but nothing converges. Each action exists in isolation, technically correct, procedurally sound, strategically cautious. Accountability fragments into components that never fully recombine. No single step fails. The sequence simply never completes. This is where precedent quietly mutates, not through rulings, but through exhaustion. Future actors will not reference outcomes. They will reference duration. How long something can remain unresolved without consequence becomes the new benchmark. What once required closure now only requires persistence. The absence of collapse is misread as stability. Inside the system, this produces a subtle inversion of risk. Action becomes dangerous. Delay becomes safe. Clarity becomes exposure. Ambiguity becomes protection. Not because anyone decreed it so, but because incentives recalibrate themselves in prolonged uncertainty. Survival logic replaces corrective logic. Institutions learn not how to solve the problem, but how to coexist with it. Public memory thins. Not erased, just diluted. The process remains visible but loses sharpness. Each new development feels smaller than the last, not because it is, but because the system has trained observers to expect nothing final. Attention becomes a resource that must be conserved elsewhere. What cannot end cannot compete. And still, everything remains technically intact. The Constitution has not been amended. The courts still function. Congress still convenes. The Department of Justice still operates. Nothing dramatic has happened. That is precisely the point. The system absorbs the strain by stretching, not breaking, by allowing contradiction to persist without resolution. At this stage, the danger is no longer located in any decision. It lives in the precedent of non-decision, in the demonstration that the highest accountability mechanisms in the system can remain permanently activated without producing an endpoint, a signal to future power that pressure can be survived, not by winning, but by waiting. There is no collapse here, no rupture, no moment of reckoning, only a slow procedural drift toward a state where the existence of accountability no longer guarantees its effect, where mechanisms remain available, but expectations quietly adjust downward, where the system continues to function while gradually abandoning the assumption that it must eventually respond. And somewhere within this extended pause, the most unsettling realization takes shape: that the system was never designed to answer the same question over and over again, that it can investigate itself, it can restrain itself, it can even accuse itself, but it was never built to live permanently inside that posture. So the process continues, not forward, not backward, sideways, maintained by habit, caution, and fear of consequence, a constitutional motion without trajectory, a machine running without destination, still active, still lawful, still unresolved.